Have you ever found yourself in the right place at the right time, changing not just someone else's day but your own life as well? On a stormy night in the small rain-soaked town of Hazelwood, Alison locked up the little cafe where she had worked tirelessly for the past 4 years. David was a man whose car broke down one evening, but who he turned out to be would leave us truly surprised. At just 28, she had taken on responsibilities that left her little room to dream. The weight of her family's needs, especially her younger brother Joe's university education, filled her days with purpose but also drained her of joy. The rain poured relentlessly, hammering against the cafe's windows. Alison glanced outside and sighed, the flickering streetlights doing little to illuminate the dark, waterlogged street. She pulled on her worn jacket and muttered to herself, at least home is close by. Turning the key in the door, she locked up, the sound muffled by the constant roar of the rain. As she stepped outside, she pulled her hood tighter around her face, bracing against the cold wind. But then a noise broke through the sound of the rain, a faint metallic clinking. Alison turned, her heart skipping a beat. In the dim light of the street, illuminated only by sporadic flashes of lightning, she saw a man hunched over the hood of a car. The rain drenched everything and the figure struggled with the vehicle, his movements tense and hurried. "Hey, do you need help?" Alison called out, her voice barely cutting through the storm. The man turned, his silhouette illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning. "My car won't start," he shouted back, his voice tinged with frustration and a hint of embarrassment. As he approached, the storm revealed his features, a man in his early 30s with damp, tousled brown hair and piercing eyes. His coat was soaked through, clinging to his frame as he shivered visibly. Alison could see his breath fogging in the cold air as he spoke. "Could I use your phone?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost sheepish. Alison hesitated for only a moment before gesturing toward the cafe. "Come inside," she said, her tone firm yet kind. "You're freezing out here." Stay tuned because this story is about to take an unexpected turn. If you're enjoying it so far, please like and subscribe to support more stories like this. She unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting him enter first. The man paused, dripping water onto the floor, his hesitation evident. Alison flipped on the heaters and gestured toward one of the tables. "Sit down. Warm up," she said, already walking toward the counter. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice genuine but subdued. He rubbed his hands together, trying to bring warmth back to his fingers. "I was visiting the university nearby and got caught in this storm. Then my car broke down and I can't figure out what's wrong with it." Alison glanced over her shoulder as she reached for the coffee pot. "That's a lot of bad luck for one night," she said, filling a cup. "Here, have this. It'll help." The man took the cup with both hands, the warmth visibly soothing him. For the first time he smiled faintly, his expression softening. "Thanks. I really appreciate it." "Don't mention it," Alison replied, sitting across from him. "What were you doing at the university, if you don't mind me asking?" "Just visiting," he said with a shrug. "I had something to take care of, but clearly I wasn't prepared for this weather." Alison nodded, taking in the sight of him, his drenched clothes, his tired eyes. She could tell he wasn't used to asking for help, much like herself. For a moment they sat in silence, the storm raging outside, but inside the little cafe, there was an unexpected sense of calm. As the warmth of the coffee spread through him, the man finally introduced himself. "My name's David," he said, his voice steadying now. "Alison," she replied with a small smile. The rain continued to drum against the windows as they sat at the small cafe table, the heaters humming softly in the background. David glanced at Alison, noticing how naturally she carried herself. "There's a mechanic not too far from here," Alison said, breaking the silence. "If you'd like, I can call them for you." David nodded quickly. "That'd be great, thank you." Alison picked up the phone and dialed. As she spoke to the mechanic, her tone was casual yet confident, like she was speaking to an old friend. It caught David's attention. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "How long have you lived here?" he asked after she hung up. "Pretty much my whole life," Alison replied. She began to tell him about her little town, her job at the cafe, and her family. Her voice was calm and soothing like a melody. David found himself captivated, not just by her words but by her presence. Her brown eyes seemed to hold a depth of kindness and resilience that he couldn't ignore. As much as he tried to tell himself it was just the stormy night or his vulnerable state that made her so mesmerizing, he couldn't shake the feeling. There's something special about her, he thought. A sudden knock at the door broke the moment. Alison stood and walked over, her figure illuminated by the warm glow of the cafe lights. Opening the door, she greeted the mechanic, a middle-aged man who gave a polite nod. "Evening," the mechanic said, stepping inside briefly to shake off the rain. After a quick introduction, David turned to Alison and asked, "How much do I owe you for all of this?" "Don't be ridiculous," Alison said with a small laugh. "It was nice meeting you, David." David hesitated for a moment, wanting to say more, but the mechanic motioned for him to follow. Together, they headed out into the rain toward David's car. Alison stood at the door for a moment, watching them before locking up. As Alison walked home through the pouring rain, her mind kept drifting back to David. "Get a grip, Alison," she thought, pulling her hood tighter. But his smile and the depth in his eyes lingered. When she arrived home, soaked to the bone, her brother Joe greeted her with a teasing grin. "Did you swim home?" he joked, handing her a towel. "Very funny," Alison replied, drying her hair. "How was your day?" "Great. Guess what? Tomorrow a top entrepreneur is coming to my school. He's my role model. I hope I get to meet him." "Who?" Alison asked, curious. Joe dashed to his room, returning with a magazine. He flipped to a page and beamed. "David Osborne. He's incredible." Alison froze, staring at the photo of the man she'd met earlier. Her thoughts raced, piecing it all together. For a moment she was speechless, then managed a small laugh. "I hope you get to meet him," she said, handing the magazine back. Later that night, Alison lay in bed, unable to shake the excitement growing in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt something spark within her, a quiet thrill she hadn't realized she missed. The next morning, Joe rushed out early, brimming with excitement. Alison teased him about his eagerness, but inside, her thoughts remained on David. The day at the cafe passed in its usual rhythm until Joe called later, his voice ecstatic. "Alison, I met him. And guess what? He wants to visit the town with me after school." Her heart skipped a beat. "That's amazing," she replied, trying to sound casual. As the day drew to a close, Alison cleaned the cafe, convincing herself it was all a coincidence. But just as she was finishing, the door opened. "Hey sis, we're here." Joe's voice rang out. Behind him stood David, his eyes fixed on Alison. David's quiet hi sent her heart racing. Joe introduced him enthusiastically, only to pause in surprise when David said, "Alison? You know each other?" Joe asked, bewildered. "Kind of," Alison replied with a soft smile. Joe grinned. "And you didn't tell me?" David couldn't take his eyes off her, his quiet presence filling the space between them. Later, after Joe left, David returned to the cafe. Hesitant but resolute, he stepped inside and faced Alison. "I'm not great at this," he began, "but I want to get to know you." "Really?" Alison felt her heart race again. She smiled, her words soft but genuine. "If you want to get to know me, then take your time. Like everyone else does." David nodded, his gaze steady. "Take my time," he repeated. From that night on, David and Alison stayed in touch, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. He became a part of her world, and she found herself rediscovering dreams she thought she'd lost. A year later, Alison stood in front of her new cafe, hanging the sign, "Alison's Corner Cafe." David stood beside her, smiling. "This beginning is special, isn't it?" he said. Alison smiled back. "And it all started with a cup of coffee and a rainy night."